Welcome to the deep dive. You know, sometimes a word pops up and you might think you have a handle on what it means, but uh, underneath the surface, there's a whole tangled history.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're plunging into one of those words, Peckerwood.
Right?
We've gathered a fascinating range of sources for you, everything from the Oxford English Dictionary to analysis from the Anti-Defamation League, historical documents, news reports, all to kind of understand the journey of this term.
Yeah, it's quite a mix.
Our goal isn't just to define it, but to trace its evolution from, well, a racial slur to its association with a specific subculture, particularly within prison and some street gangs.
It's a real look at how language shifts and how identity gets forged in sometimes unexpected places.
Absolutely. What's fascinating here is how a seemingly simple, almost countrified word can accumulate such a heavy load of historical meaning and then, transform into something linked to organized criminal activity.
Exactly. The variety of sources you've pulled together really lets us dissect this transformation pretty thoroughly.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. Peckerwood. It seems to have its origins in the American South, right? And the dictionaries suggest it might be an alteration of woodpecker.
That's the main theory, yes. The idea of an inversion of woodpecker is what the OED and etymology sites point to.
An inversion,
Well,
okay.
it's not a recent coinage. The earliest documented use we've found is in an Alabama newspaper way, way back in 1835.
1835, wow.
Yeah, so this term has some real roots, deep roots.
And by the mid-1800s, it wasn't just a quirky nickname. It was being used to refer to white people, often with maybe a subtle implication of them being less sophisticated, maybe rural.
Right, definitely not among the elite. The online etymology dictionary really highlights that sense of it being a descriptor for white people, often with that added layer suggesting they were rustic or poor.
Rustic or poor, okay.
And it's interesting to see that even the shortened version, peck, pops up in the 1920s with a similar kind of connotation.
So the negative undertones were pretty persistent then.
Seems like it, yeah, even in casual usage.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. Our sources point out that in African-American folklore of the 1920s, the peckerwood bird wasn't just a bird. It became a symbol for white Americans.
Uh-huh.
Often positioned in contrast to the blackbird, which represented African Americans. It even made its way into jive, apparently.
Yeah, which suggests it had a certain currency within those cultural circles.
So what does this tell us about the racial dynamics back then?
Well, this early symbolic use really reveals how deeply ingrained racial categories were in the societal consciousness,
Yeah.
even shaping seemingly innocuous language.
Right.
It kind of sets the stage for understanding how a term already loaded with racial meaning could later be adopted and twisted by white supremacist groups seeking their own form of identity.
Mhm.
The fact that it appeared in folklore and jive indicates it was a term with a certain level of recognition and understanding within specific communities, even if the connotations were, well, varied.
Now, shifting gears quite a bit,
Hmm.
we see peckerwood appearing in a very different context. Prisons. Initially, it seems it was a pretty broad term, almost just a label applied to white prisoners generally. There's even this informal name for the cemetery at Leavenworth Penitentiary, Peckerwood Hill.
Yeah, Peckerwood Hill. That really gives you a sense of how widespread the term must have been within the prison system back then.
So what led to this broad application? Was it just common slang?
For a long time, it seems Peckerwood functioned almost as a general identifier for white inmates, likely reflecting the racial segregation and dynamics within the prison system itself.
Okay.
But then, in the latter half of the 20th century, the term starts to become more specific. It narrows its focus to a particular white subculture deeply connected to street and prison gangs.
And that's where the Aryan Brotherhood comes in.
The Aryan Brotherhood, a notorious white supremacist prison gang, is a prime example here, yeah. This is where the term really gets cemented with that specific extremist element.
So this is where we see the emergence of what our sources call PW, PW, or the woodpile.
Yeah.
And within this subculture, there's a whole internal language and symbolism developing.
Yeah.
Men are peckerwoods, women are featherwoods.
Right, and the woodpecker itself becomes a really significant symbol, often appearing in tattoos.
What's the significance of this kind of internal lexicon, building identity?
Absolutely. This internal language and symbolism are crucial for building group cohesion and establishing identity within these subcultures. Using specific terms for men and women, adopting a shared symbol like the woodpecker, it helps create a sense of belonging, distinguishes members from outsiders.
Makes sense.
What's also fascinating is how this symbol gets used. It's not always just a generic woodpecker. Sometimes it's a clear nod to cartoon characters like Woody Woodpecker.
Really? Woody woodpecker?
Yeah, or even the hot rod icon Mr. Horsepower. This blending of seemingly disparate cultural references is kind of a hallmark of how these subcultures often operate. They take existing symbols and reinterpret them with their own specific meaning.
Huh. Interesting.
And the use of PW or APW American Peckerwood further solidifies this sense of shared identity and allegiance.
Okay, let's delve deeper into these prison gang networks. Our sources indicate that Peckerwood can even be used for entry-level recruits of the Aryan Brotherhood.
That's right, kind of a starting point.
But it gets a bit confusing because within the prison system itself, Peckerwood is sometimes used as a catch-all term for, like, any white supremacist threat group.
Yes, and that absolutely creates challenges for authorities.
How so?
Well, when a term is used both for a broad category and for specific subgroups within that category, it can obscure the actual organizational structures. It makes it harder to track the nuances of the different groups involved.
Right, makes intelligence gathering tricky.
Exactly, and prosecution, too. Our sources highlight that the Peckerwood prison subculture is most entrenched in places like California, Texas, and the U.S. South and Southwest.
And the rise of these gangs seems to be directly linked to a pretty significant historical event, the desegregation of U.S. prisons in the 1960s.
A critical point, yeah.
The Aryan Brotherhood, for instance, formed in San Quentin in '64, and it was explicitly a response to the formation of the Black guerrilla family. What was that dynamic like?
Well, the desegregation of prisons, while obviously a necessary step, inadvertently created an environment where racial tensions could escalate. Inmates often segregated themselves along racial lines for protection, for solidarity. The Aryan Brotherhood emerged within this context as a white prison gang seeking to assert its dominance and protect its members within this newly integrated and often volatile environment.
And the story continues with the emergence of offshoots and related groups. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, formed in the 80s.
Right, after the old segregated building tender system was dismantled. It was a merger of two other white gangs, the Aryan Society and Aryan Brothers.
Then you had the Aryan Circle forming in 1985, apparently by members who felt ABT wasn't truly committed enough.
Yeah, that they didn't truly uphold the white supremacist ideals they claimed. This kind of fracturing and reformation based on ideology and perceived levels of commitment is a common pattern in extremist subcultures.
They even started as Aryan Christians before changing the name.
They did, which really highlights the internal debates and evolving identities within these networks. It suggests that even within a seemingly unified ideology, there can be significant variations in beliefs and priorities, leading to the formation of distinct factions.
Our sources also mention the International Peckerwood Syndicate, or Insane Peckerwood Syndicate, operating up in Oregon and Washington prisons, forming around 2005.
Yep.
And it seems the term Peckerwood just keeps popping up in gang names in other states, too. Connecticut, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico. The list goes on.
It really underscores how pervasive this terminology became within the prison system across the country.
Is there a sense of a national network, though, or are these mostly localized groups just using the same name?
While there might be some level of, interstate communication and shared ideology, our sources suggest that these Peckerwood groups often operate with a significant degree of autonomy, state level, even local level.
So the term acts more like an umbrella.
Pretty much. An umbrella identifier for a certain segment of the white prison population, often associated with white supremacist ideologies, even if their specific affiliations and levels of formal organization vary quite a bit.
There's a really chilling detail from one of our sources, a 2013 murder case where a gang member was reportedly required under something called Peckerwood law to harm a white person who had a history of child molestation.
Yeah, that's a stark illustration.
It gives you a glimpse into the brutal, sort of twisted moral codes that can develop within these groups.
Absolutely. It highlights the dangers of these insular environments and the potential for violence driven by these self-defined laws. It suggests a level of internal governance and a demand for adherence to these codes, however warped they are.
Now, this whole Peckerwood subculture isn't just confined to prison walls, is it?
No, definitely not. It extends to street gangs.
And these groups seem to blend white power, skinhead culture with more traditional street gang activities, like drug dealing.
That's right. They tend to form in lower-income white neighborhoods, according to our sources. What's interesting about these street gangs is how they represent a kind of modern iteration of white power ideology.
Different.
Yeah, but one that incorporates elements from other subcultures, particularly California Latino gang culture, surprisingly enough, as well as influences from extreme sports and even cannabis subculture.
That's quite a mix.
It is. It shows it's not a static, monolithic movement. It's adapting, absorbing elements from its surroundings, creating this unique hybrid identity.
And the stylistic mashup is pretty striking, too. You mentioned Pendletons and baggy pants mixed with Doc Martens, bomber jackets, shaved heads.
It's a visual representation of that cultural blending, yeah. And they identify strongly with the color white. White caps, white handkerchiefs.
And the hand sign.
The hand sign, forming PW with the hands, is another clear identifier. These visual markers and symbols are crucial for establishing identity and signaling affiliation out on the street.
So that blend of styles, it communicates something specific.
It speaks to the fluidity of subcultures, how individuals might draw from different cultural touchstones to create their own sense of belonging, maybe rebellion, while still adhering to core ideological tenets. The color white and the specific hand sign act as those immediate visual cues of affiliation.
Now, many of the California Peckerwood street gangs, they operate under the authority of the Nazi lowriders.
Correct. The NLR acts as a kind of umbrella group that includes not just these Peckerwood gangs, but also punk gangs and skinhead alliances.
And Public Enemy number 1, PEN1, which started in Long Beach in the late 80s, they're a major player in this Peckerwood gang world.
A major player, yes, and closely allied with the Nazi lowriders. They're even known for recruiting from the Southern California punk scene, interestingly.
So that suggests a more organized structure at play on the streets compared to maybe the prison situation.
Well, the alliance with the Nazi lowriders definitely demonstrates a hierarchical nature within this broader subculture on the outside. PEN1, also known as Peony Death Squad, became prominent in Orange County through recruitment by the Nazi lowriders. That shows how these networks expand and consolidate power beyond prison walls.
Right.
And the idea of smaller gangs like PEN and Insane White Boys being considered kids within the hierarchy, with Nazi lowrider groups as seniors, that further emphasizes this structured, albeit informal, organization.
Is there movement between those ranks?
Apparently so.
Right.
There's even a system for advancement within these ranks, suggesting a level of internal social mobility within the subculture.
Okay, but despite this apparent structure at the local level and within these alliances, our sources point out that U.S. courts haven't consistently recognized Peckerwood as one single large gang.
That's a key point, legally speaking.
Why is that? Lack of formal structure.
Seems to be. Due to a lack of a formal constitution and a generally loose organizational structure overall, the 2008 People v. Williams case is a key example.
What happened there?
The court ruled that the small-town Peckerwoods, despite sharing an ideology and a name, weren't legally part of a larger, unified organization.
So what are the implications of that legal perspective? Makes things difficult.
It highlights the challenge of defining and prosecuting these types of groups. While they may share common ideologies and symbols, that lack of a formal, centralized command structure can make it difficult to classify them as traditional gangs under, say, RICO statutes or gang enhancement laws. It raises an important question for the legal system about how to understand and address loosely affiliated groups banned more by shared beliefs and cultural practices than by formal rules and hierarchies.
And just to add another layer, interestingly, the name Peckerwoods is also used by a Santee, California-based outlaw motorcycle club that formed back in 1987.
Right, the Peckerwoods Motorcycle Club.
Local police report their patches and clothing include Nazi imagery, and some members have been linked to hate crimes, though the club itself denies having racist affiliations.
Yeah, that adds another layer to the complexity of the term and its associated imagery, doesn't it?
It does.
It shows how a name with clearly racist origins can be adopted and potentially reinterpreted, or at least have its connotations downplayed by different groups in different contexts, raises questions about intent versus perception, you know?
Definitely. How the public perceives these symbols and names, regardless of what the groups themselves claim.
Precisely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, you can really see how the term Peckerwood has undergone this significant and frankly kind of wild transformation.
It really has.
From a derogatory label for poor, rural white people, it's evolved into a term deeply intertwined with a specific and often troubling subculture both inside and outside of prison.
Our sources really illustrate the fluid nature of language, don't they?
Right.
How words can be reclaimed, repurposed, imbued with new, sometimes very dark, meanings depending on the social and historical circumstances.
Yeah. And the varying degrees of organization we've seen within these Peckerwood groups.
Yeah.
It presents some really complex challenges for law enforcement and the legal system.
Exactly. What's truly fascinating is the journey itself. A slur born out of social stratification and racial undertones becomes a badge of identity, albeit within a subculture often associated with hateful ideologies.
Yeah.
It compels us to consider how language can function both as a tool of oppression and as a means of forging group identity,
Mhm.
and how the meaning of a word is never static, it's constantly being shaped and reshaped by those who use it.
And that brings us to a final thought for you listening. Considering this complex evolution of Peckerwood and the diverse groups that have, at different times and in different ways, been associated with it,
Mm.
what does this tell us about the enduring power of language? How it can both inflict harm and create a sense of belonging?
Yeah.
And how do these loosely connected groups, united more by shared ideology than by formal structures, challenge our conventional understanding of gang dynamics and how society should respond to them?
Good questions to ponder.
Definitely something to keep in mind as you go about your day. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.